Welcome again to the fabulous Time Centre. So good afternoon if that didn't come across on the microphone before. Welcome again. For those of you who weren't here for this morning's session, my name is Damien Ryan and I am the Acting CEO of the Climate Group, the convener of Climate Week NYC 2016. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce what I know will be an engaging afternoon of discussion and debate. Raising the Standard, a high-level progress review and call to action on buildings and renovation is the name of today's event, hosted by a very good friend and partner, Philips Lighting, in association with the World Green Building Council. I suspect I don't have to tell anyone here in the room about the importance of buildings in tackling climate change. But for the record, the homes, the offices, and the other structures that we rely on to live and work in account for around a third of global greenhouse gas emissions, according to the UN Environment Programme. Now, most of these emissions are indirect through the use of fossil fuels that we burn to heat, cool, and power where we live and work. As a result, making our buildings more energy efficient is something of a no-brainer. I'm very glad, therefore, that this afternoon's event is all about finding solutions that can drive energy efficiency improvements in buildings through renovation, including lighting, which in turn reduce emissions in both new and existing buildings. Now, energy efficiency is something very close to the Climate Group's own heart within the built environment. 8 years ago, we ran the first ever LED streetlight trials here in New York in Central Park and along FDR Drive. And I'm pleased to say that today, New York City is replacing 250,000 streetlights with LEDs that will save taxpayers $14 million a year. So you can see the kind of transformational effect that energy retrofitting can have for a city. We're also very proud of the subsequent work we've done with Philips to help expand the use of LED lighting in other cities around the world. And I'm also very pleased to report that today, the Big Apple's own icon, the Great Empire State Building, no stranger itself to groundbreaking energy efficiency retrofits, will be turning green at sunset to mark the start of Climate Week NYC 2016. So something to look out for. And I think on that appropriate note, I'd like to hand it over to a real expert on this subject, the CEO of Philips Lighting, Eric Rondelet. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Damien. So, warm welcome to all of you. Just a few facts. NASA has reported that July 2016 was the hottest month in the recorded history of the world. And that's a fact. We know also that the planet is warming up at unprecedented rates. So I have two rulers, a small one and a big one. So the small one shows to us that 9 inches is the ocean level rise in the past 150 years. If we don't change anything by the end of this century, we would have to look at a totally different measure, because we're going to talk about 6.5 feet of ocean rise level. 40% of the American population is living in the coastal area and would be touched by this. So, is there anything we can do about it? There are so many things we can do about it. And we decided, for the next event to concentrate on a very specific segment, to be as pragmatic and as detailed as possible. And we're going to talk about buildings. Buildings basically account for today 40% of the energy consumption, on the planet, and we can make the buildings smarter. And it's not only talking about the lighting in the building, it's also talking about the ceiling and making the ceiling smart. It's also making sure that we build sustainable buildings all around the world. In order to do so, we need the combination and we need the alignment between companies, like us, but also government bodies, regulators, in order to speed up what is happening at this point in time, because I always say that when I look at what is doable today versus what we are actually doing, the gap is absolutely huge. So you will see different experts coming, and I have the pleasure to introduce for the panel, Terry Wills. So she is the CEO of the World Green Building Council, and she will introduce and moderate the panel. Terry, thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. It is alarming when you think about the numbers and where we're headed with climate change if we don't dramatically change the way that we build, and that includes lighting. So that's really what our panel is going to be discussing today. I'd like to introduce the panelists and invite them to come up on stage one by one. The first is I'd like to introduce Ed Mazria, who often needs no introduction. Ed Mazria is the founder of Architecture 2030. He is an architect. He's also an author. Architecture 2030 is a think tank that I know has inspired us significantly to do more faster. So I'm really pleased to welcome Ed. I'd also like to welcome Bill Bean, who's the CMO and head of strategy at Philips Lighting. Ken Alex, who's the senior policy advisor to Governor Jerry Brown. And Rob Cicero from Cisco Systems. And I'd like to invite all of the panelists to sit down, except for Ed, who's going to give us an overview, get into a little bit more detail about the science, the numbers, and impress upon us the urgency of the challenge that we have ahead of us. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me and having me here. We'll get started. We want to talk about the, whoops, it's going backwards. We want to talk about the building sector and why it's so important to get a handle on this sector if we're going to address this issue. So what happened in Paris and how does the building sector fit into all this? Well, we know that there was a long-term goal that was set to stay well below 2 degrees C, and if we can get there to 1.5 degrees C. Why is that so important? Why is that science so important? Well, there were a number of scenarios that the IPCC ran, and the only scenario that actually gets us under 2 degrees C is RCP 2.6. They call it the 2 degrees C scenario. That's peaking in 2020 and phasing out all fossil fuel CO2 emissions by about 2070, 2080. That gives us a 66% chance of staying below 2 degrees C, but it also gives us a 33% chance of going above. So there was a fifth scenario that was run that's peaking very, very soon between now and 2020 and phasing out all emissions from fossil fuels by 2050. That's why you hear all these 80 by 50s, 0 by 50s commitments. That 2050 date is really key if we're to have a high probability of staying under 2 degrees C. The reason it's important to stay under 2 degrees C is then we can bring the planet back to pre-industrial levels. Otherwise, once we sail past that threshold, climate change becomes more or less irreversible. So the building sector. So how does this fit into all of this? Well, today, world population is at about 7.2 billion people. By 2030, world population is expected to be about 8.3 billion people, an increase of 1.1 billion people. The projections also tell us that by 2030, world urban population is expected to increase by 1.1 billion people, absorbing the entire population growth estimate. That means people moving into cities. What is 1.1 billion people? To give you a handle on that, that's the equivalent of the entire population of the Western Hemisphere. That's the US, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile. That's how many people we're going to grow in the next 15 years, roughly, and that is going to happen mostly in urban areas, and we're going to need to build out that much infrastructure and buildings for that many people. So we know roughly, you've heard this, that cities are responsible for anywhere from 65 to 75% of all human-produced global greenhouse gas emissions. What's really fascinating is we just completed a study of the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions attributed to just buildings in cities. That's just building operations. And if we take a look, New York City, 71%, Atlanta, 66%, London, 79%, Copenhagen, 66%, even Los Angeles, it's above 50%, it's 54%. That's just buildings. So we need to phase out CO2 emissions by 2050. How do we do that? We've developed a roadmap for urban areas and cities and the building sector to do that. First, we need high-performance new buildings. So new buildings coming in need to be very high performance so they don't exacerbate the situation. Second, we need deep efficiency renovations of all the buildings that exist in the world today. That needs to happen at a very rapid pace. I'll talk about that very quickly in a minute. And of course, we need renewable energy to make up the difference, what we can't reduce. So on a scale, if we put a typical modern building at 100 and zero net carbon at 0, our building codes today roughly fall around 50% reduction. So in 2017, we need to have adopted that. By 2020, we need a 40% better code. By 2025, we need, a 20% better. By 2025, we need a 40% better. And then by 2030, all building codes really throughout the world need to be zero net carbon. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to make it. But to get to zero net carbon is essentially adding renewables from a very efficient code. And we're actually developing these code standards now. We're developing the 20%, the 40%, and the zero net energy code. We're working with MBI, who's developing the standards, and the Department of Energy, who's running the simulations to make sure we meet those standards. And then second, we need deep efficiency renovations. We need to renovate 2 to 3% of our building stock every year to fairly deep efficiency standards. That is not an easy task. Roughly, we build about 0.5%, maybe close to 1%, somewhere in there, of new buildings. We renovate about 0.5%, maybe up to 1%, and they offset each other. So we got to get at that other percentage. That's why we say 2 to 3%. And that the normal renovation cycle, but the building intervention points, the key is whenever there's a zoning or a use change, we need to require that they meet the energy code, that the building meets the energy code. And on building purchases, on the buyer, not the seller, on the buyer, they need to meet also the updated codes. This is absolutely critical if we're to get at this 2 to 3%. And how do they meet the code? They either meet the energy code by doing efficiency renovations, or if the building's occupied and they can't do deep efficiency renovations, they do a minimum, and then they purchase the rest, or either produce it on site or purchase it off site. In that way, we get at 2 to 3%. And a number of cities we're working with have been talking about a carbon fund of the purchaser putting in money into a carbon fund that's refundable if he does the efficiency renovations or purchases the renewables. That creates the incentive in the marketplace for all the renewables coming in, because that's a huge percentage of buildings that would have to be renovated or produce or operate using renewables. So right now, to finish up, we're working with 10 cities on this strategy. We'll be developing comprehensive plans for each one of these cities tailored to their needs. And we're running a big conference on getting to zero with the design set, all the local design institutes and international firms in China, and that'll be happening next month. With that, we'll turn it over to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. Every time I hear the numbers, it makes me feel that there's so much still we need to do, and we need to move faster and faster. But I think the number that has or kind of the statistic that's driven us a lot at World Green Building Council is when you say that all new buildings really need to be net zero emissions by 2030. And you said that means building code has to be net zero emissions. It means any new building needs to be that. And I think we still have a ways to go. I mean, I'd love to see a show of hands from the audience. How many of you have ever been in a net zero emissions building? Okay, a few, which is good. That's a good sign. There's still so much more we need to do. And I think, the topic for today is particularly focused around energy efficiency, because in order for a building to be net zero emissions, you need to get to deep energy efficiency. And then the remaining energy use needs to be renewable, either on-site or off-site. But you can't get to net zero unless there's that deep energy efficiency. But I think there's been some tremendous progress. I know that this is what we see. If we're looking back at the last year, we think there's been a lot of momentum created from the Paris Agreement, I think particularly for the building sector. I mean, we were really excited to see last year at the COP21 in Paris that for the first time there was a dedicated Buildings Day. And it was the first time that there was a real recognition that buildings were a third of the problem. Basically, they're a third of global greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. But what that also means is buildings can be a third of the solution, and what we find inside buildings. So for us, that's been a really driving force. It's been galvanizing for us as a movement. So what I'd love to do is just open to the panel, each to give a few minutes overview on likewise what you're seeing in your sector that is encouraging, and what you're seeing that is showing progress, that we are seeing there has been significant change in the last year. And Bill, I'd love to start with you from Philip's perspective.
Yeah, sure. So from a Phillips lighting perspective, what's important to our customers, which is what matters, is really the renovation or the reconstruction of buildings. And I'd like to talk about it in three ways. One is the supply of building stock, how much time people spend there, the demand for retrofits and the benefits that come from that, and then the actions that are necessary. So Terry and everybody else, what we see is that people spend up to 80 to 90% of their time in buildings. We don't want to admit it, but we're basically building creatures. And so you have to have the best building possible, and that's what we're trying to work with. But the other thing is, I just want to reiterate that you heard this morning, is that building consumption or that building occupancy leads to about 30 to 40% of the energy load that we all have in the world. And if you couple these two with the fact that only 15 to 20% of the building stock's renovated on an annual, on a normal basis, you see the need to work better and to do it more aggressively, and that's what we've been working on. So what we like to encourage people to do is to now think about it in terms of the retrofit. What's actually happening in terms of energy efficiency? And this is where you see a disparity, which we're trying to address with others on the panel, and we encourage you to do too, which is energy consumption is increasing at 3% a year. We're only retrofitting at 1.5% a year, so we have this huge gap. So we have to look for easy solutions. It's renewables, of course, but also it's the fifth renewable energy, which is energy efficiency. And what we can say is that for LED itself is that by just simply changing your light fixtures, you can reduce that energy consumption. And a reminder, lighting consumes 15% of the world energy consumption for electricity. You can reduce it in half. And what we've done this past year with Cisco and others is actually explore what more can you do. And we've been working on this for 4 or 5 years by ourselves, and now we're very happy to work with others as well, which is if you connect that lighting system to software, to networks, you start to get this tremendous benefit of the Internet of Things and connected systems, where it's not just the energy savings, it does double, right? So you're talking a change from 50% energy reduction to 70 to 80% energy reduction, which is great. But in addition, you start to get employee benefits because you can now actually have zonal lighting over people. You can choose what you want. You can have a better color of light. You start to get what we call human-centric lighting, which is people are more productive. They heal better if they're in hospitals. It's pretty fascinating stuff. And also from a facility manager point of view, you can also set the level that you want people to consume to be able to do that. And then if you go away from the buildings for just office space to the buildings for now shopping, you can start to see lighting used in a different way, which is the lighting will actually send a wavelength down. This is physics. It actually happens. Where if you are able to read that wavelength through your phone, which is possible, you can now actually engage consumers, helping them find what they need. So beacons are just not wireless, they're also light, and it's a very good technology. So all these things are possible with an infrastructure that can be renovated. And that leads to the action question, which is why aren't we doing it more quickly? And that's a question really of policy and action. And what we see is that really the retrofit needs to happen, and I would say for retrofits to happen more quickly, two things. One, every occupant, every tenant, every owner needs to think about a change in ownership as an opportunity to achieve LEED status and to become greener through not just lighting, but through other changes. I would also challenge the members of the finance community here to work with the building community to figure out if we're going to accelerate renovation, let's renovate finance. Right, so we can get the capital more available for the renovations. We'll talk more about what we're doing specifically, but I just wanted to throw that out there for the general discussion, and I look forward to everybody else's thoughts.
Great, thanks, Bill. And I think, you know, what we really saw at Paris too is the need for, well, the progress that companies have been making in introducing new products that are really helping us get to net zero. When we start looking at net zero, the technology is there, and that's because of the significant advances in technologies like LED. But I think what we understand too is that has to be complemented by policy, and I think there's a role both for corporations, but also for policymakers to really work together, to collaborate, but to raise the bar also. And so Ken, you know, we always follow California very closely because California is a real leader on the fight against climate change and introducing always very progressive and ambitious policies. So we'd just love to hear a bit from you about some of the policies that you've been working on introducing within the state of California and how you're seeing that is helping us move towards where we need to get to.
Well, thanks for sticking around for the afternoon. You'll be surprised to hear that there's a lot going on in California around climate. The governor signed this morning a bill on short-lived climate pollutants, methane, HFCs, and black carbon, making California, yet again, probably the leading proponent of reduction, 50% on black carbon and 40% on the other short-lived climate pollutants. And hopefully we'll see some announcements here this week on short-lived climate pollutants. The bigger picture in California is about 2 weeks ago, California extended its basic climate law, which is called AB 32, and extended it out to 2030. So we now have a 40% reduction from 1990 levels of emissions in California. So this is the world's 5th or 6th largest economy. We are putting ourselves on the road to reduce GHG emissions by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Wow. And that is a little bit of a challenge. There are 3 pieces that go with that. 2 of which are now in law, and 1 of which is in an executive order. The first piece is a 50% renewable portfolio standard, so renewables 50% by 2030. Most salient here is the second piece, which is a doubling of energy efficiency in buildings by 2030. And the third piece is a halving of oil in the transportation sector by 2030. Interestingly enough, we have had by far the most challenge with energy efficiency and existing building stock, and we'll get into why that is a little bit in a minute. But specifically on that set of issues, we now have a law that is requiring mandatory benchmarking and public disclosure for large commercial and multifamily buildings over 50,000 square feet. That's new, and there are now rules for that, and I think that's going to make a significant difference. The Public Utilities Commission in California is setting incentives. So the first effort here before we move to a more mandatory approach is to see if we can have a pay-for-performance type of a system to see if that works. The Energy Commission has just finished something called the Existing Building Energy Efficiency Action Plan, very exciting title. And it has a series of approaches, again, starting with incentives, and then we'll see how it goes moving to mandatory as needed. And we'll see how those strategies go. We already have a building code that Ed probably would appreciate, requires new residential buildings by 2025 to be net zero, and new commercial buildings by 2030. So we'll meet his goal, hopefully.
Fabulous.
And so that ratchets down over time. So it's not you get to 2025 and you have to be net zero. The building code every 2 years is revised, and that's a negotiation in part with the building community, and has gone pretty well in California. We're doing well on new buildings. We have 14 to 15 million existing buildings, and we're having trouble. We passed this year another bill to make PACE financing a little better. This one is about consumer protections. Finally, the Federal Housing Administration has found that PACE financing is acceptable, but the FHFA still has not. And let me just mention one other thing, and we'll go from there. California is finishing up a formal rulemaking with the first computer efficiency standards in the country, working very closely with the industry for about a 1/3 reduction in power usage by computers.
Wow.
So,
Fantastic.
back to you.
Yeah, and I mean, both of you have mentioned the retrofit challenge, and you know, I'm heartened that there is a lot of progress to see, you know, building code setting towards 2025, 2030 net zero for new buildings. But I think, as you both mentioned, there's still so much more that we have to do with renovation and energy efficiency. And I'd like to come on to that, because there's always a worry that we focus so much on the new build target that we forget the other target is that all buildings have to be net zero by 2050. And if we don't pay attention to the existing buildings, we'll never get there. So I'd also love to hear from you, Rob, at Cisco, some of the innovations that you're seeing that are going to help us get to this deep energy efficiency within buildings and bring us closer to net zero.
Absolutely. So people might know of Cisco, the connectors of the internet. And when we look at IoT, as Bill mentioned, the Internet of Things, the notion of connecting the unconnected, we can now do some pretty amazing things with that. And from a Cisco point of view, over the past year, we've launched something called the Digital Ceiling Framework. And when we looked at buildings and how buildings were constructed, if anyone's ever embarked on a project in terms of a smart building, it's been quite a challenge to make things work together and systems work together. From a pure technologist point of view at Cisco, the rise of the internet, the success of the internet has because it's been a standard. And that's what we're trying to do, is drive a standard within that framework to make sure that if anyone thinks about building a smart building and connecting these devices, not only from a power as well as a communications point of view, you can now realize the goals that were on set from a project perspective. So the work that we're doing with Philips from a connected lighting point of view, and the Philips side of it, I don't want to steal Bill's thunder there, really the intelligence is coming from that side of it, and we think about all the elements that are above us, not only that we can see visually, but also above the ceiling. We believe that is going to be a convergence opportunity, not just from a communication standpoint, but from a power standpoint as well. And the combination of all this is going to drive efficiencies that we've never seen in buildings before.
Fantastic.
So if I may add to that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the genesis of this is the idea that if you look around you, one of the things that surrounds you on a daily basis is electrified light. And if we spend 80 to 90% of our time inside buildings, well, let's use that as an opportunity. So what we got to is the idea that lighting with software can be intelligent, and also it's a conduit to the Internet of Things. So with Cisco providing great security and also the connection to the HVAC systems and us with working with lighting, we can actually start to make the buildings smarter more quickly. We announced it just last year. We had an application we did together in Toronto. We've been doing this for a while. Cisco joined us. And since that time, we've put in a 20,000 square meter building that is now intelligent and LEED certified. We did the lighting, Cisco did the network, and others did the intelligent HVAC in Europe. We've now done another building in Dubai. We just did a 60,000 square meter campus for IT company in India. And it continues to roll out. But it gets back to really, how do we make the building smarter? And for that, we work with architects like Ed and others to make these great buildings, great experiences for the employees first and foremost.
Yeah. And it's so important the buildings are operating smarter, because we've also heard a number of times around, net zero buildings, that sometimes the design of a net zero building doesn't always carry through to the operation. So you may design a building to be net zero, but actually when you get it ticking and working, you realize actually we're not even coming close to net zero. So having those connected systems can really help then the building owners, building users to tweak their designs as you go along and make sure that we are getting those operating emissions, which we need to track. So it's great to hear about innovations like this. And Ed, you gave us a really compelling overview of the numbers, the science, where we need to get to. On the flip side, like what are you seeing that you're encouraged by? So you see these big numbers, these big targets, and what do you think has really happened, say, in the last year that is helping us get to where we need to go?
Well, since Paris, it's been easier for us to move things along. There's a tremendous amount of interest. Before Paris, for example, before Paris in Canada and Vancouver, about a year ago, I think a little over a year ago, we issued, we talked, we were at the GBC conference, a Canadian National GBC conference, and we asked all the GBCs to develop a zero net carbon certification. There were very few. They heard the call, Terry heard the call, and then in Paris, I think it was three countries, announced that they would move toward developing a zero net carbon certification or a zero net certification. Tomorrow we start a workshop here in New York with 10 GBCs from around the world who have now pledged to develop a zero net carbon certification. What that does is it sets the marker out there and moves the marketplace toward zero net carbon. The codes are another area. We're now working with the Department of Energy and NBI to actually develop the code standards that are code adaptable all the way to zero net energy. So what we try to do is put markers out there and establish the steps to get to that marker so that we move the marketplace closer to ZNC.
No, it's great, and Ed was tremendous. He actually rung me up, I think it was before Paris, and gave me a very inspiring call to action, saying we are not even close to where we need to get to with the numbers, and the Green Building Councils have to do this, and you have to do this right now because there's no time to lose. So I think that's been really inspiring for us. And then, also in Paris, seeing companies like Philips and others make really significant commitments to reaching carbon neutral, and others followed suit. And so we saw that this was really the time that we could introduce a net zero certification because the companies were stepping up, but also, governments were starting to step up as well. We've seen Vancouver commit to no buildings below net zero standards by 2030. We're also seeing it in the state of California. But I wanted to come back to the point raised about renovation. And I think the compelling numbers are we know we need to get to about 3% annual kind of renovation rate. So that means 3% of the building stock needs to be constantly renovated to get to deeper efficiency. But we're only at about 1%. And my understanding that's around in Europe as well, where Europe, the scale of the challenge is tremendous, but also here in the US and Canada, where I'm from. So what needs to happen? Like what are the triggers that will help drive this renovation? Because it sounds like we're getting there with the new build. We've got the net zero certification, we've got companies, we've got the tremendous new technologies, but what do we need to do to get there with renovation? And Ken, I'd love to start with you because you've got the policies in place. You're saying doubling energy efficiency by 2030, but you're still not quite there. What needs to happen?
So I guess the first answer is if we knew the answer, we would
Right.
we'd be on it.
Yes,
but I have
Good
some
point.
thoughts.
Yeah, okay, let's hear it.
The first is something that I have to say I personally have been struggling with for 10 years, which is to get utilities to be more forthcoming with energy efficiency data. Now, we recognize that there are personal privacy issues, but there are ways to anonymize the data. And it has been an absolute struggle in California with the three primary IOUs, the investor-owned utilities, to get basic data so that we can understand where we should make investments. I think this allows customers to make different decisions, and I think it allows the market to make different decisions. With the benchmarking rule that we have, I think that's starting to change. I will also say that I think the country's largest municipal utility, it's certainly the largest in California, LA Department of Water and Power, has produced all of its data, given it to UCLA, and you can go on a website that UCLA maintains and look at that energy efficiency data, and it's already started to change how we go after some of this information. So that's one. I'll do one other really quickly. A lot of energy efficiency investment, while it saves money over time, it does, unlike LEDs. LEDs may be the real exception to this, but a lot of energy efficiency takes 5 to 10 years, and a lot of companies look and say, I don't have 5 or 10 years to make my money back. I need to have 2 or 3. And so we need to either change the policies or we need to change our understanding of how that investment is beneficial to the company.
It's a great point. The 5 to 10 years, it does strike me because there's so many companies that you're right that you look 10 years ahead and you think I'm thinking about my budget next year, not 10 years from now. And one of the things that we've found really encouraging actually is also the link with health and well-being. And I know Bill, you mentioned this a little bit about human-centric lighting, and we're also wondering does this help make the case for renovation in the shorter term, because you can say, well, you've got maybe 5 to 10 years payback from an energy efficiency perspective, but actually if you're implementing lighting but other technologies and building other design features that can demonstrate significant benefits for people working in offices, people living in homes, that you can make that business case faster. What are your thoughts on some of that, Bill? Focus on the kind of renovation challenge we've got ahead of us.
Yeah, I think we do need to take an employee-centric view. I was just with one of our purchasers of a lighting system talking to them, and it's in a very big installation. I can't give all the details, but it's tens of thousands of square meters. And their point was the employee engagement with the system, and it was not just lighting, it was also an intelligent HVAC system as well, was 80% positive in terms of giving the employees the ability to actually control their area. And think about that. You go to work, you sit down in your cube, and it's somebody else's. Well, these employees felt like this is my space now. Most of the time, they didn't even turn the switch, so to speak, but they just felt better about their workplace because they were given control of their space. And I think that's a huge engagement opportunity. And again, we're doing studies as well as about kids being more engaged in schools, and we're seeing positive results on that. But I want to segue back to another idea, which is really we have to listen to what the data and the technology tells us. I think the technology actually shows that there is a benefit, and so I'd challenge the finance community to think about that. Where how can we actually now, with software automation, you can start getting a sense of the number of people in a building, their activities in a building, their usage in a building, and the privacy concerns are important, but you can anonymize all of it through the camera sensors, so you don't have to worry about individuals, but you can think about the load. And as a result, now you can start getting into buildings as a service, right? Where you start charging on an OpEx model for the infrastructure with the building, and you break this whole CapEx strangle on renovation. So we're actually doing this right now in Europe. We're doing lighting as a service, where we've introduced just this past year at Schiphol Airport and about 5 or 6 other installations in Europe, where you think differently about infrastructure, where we've actually redesigned the infrastructure of lighting so it's modular. So if it breaks, and it usually doesn't over the course of 10 to 15 years, but in case you wanted to update it, now instead of taking the whole thing out, you can just simply take out a part very quickly and put it in a new part. And we challenge the rest of the industry to think that way, where with the benefits of modular manufacturing and software, we can start to automate this whole building much more, not just for the benefits of the users, which are paramount, but also for the benefits of the building owners and those who manage it.
So Bill, in that situation, if you're moving towards lighting as a service, and it's an interesting idea, buildings as a service as well, is that the idea then is that you don't need to worry about that 5 to 10 year payback because you're not having to make the capital investment yourself up front because
you make up the OpEx.
Right.
You treat it rather than as a CapEx, as an OpEx.
As an OpEx.
And this again is, we're not the only ones doing this, but we see the banks that are very involved in this actually now financing the deal based on the returns. And this is where the software comes in, because now you can start to guarantee certain savings over time. And then it becomes almost a forfeiting for the banking industry. And that's where our friends in government, if there's some way actually with the benchmarking that you've done and the other rules, this will start to stimulate demand for this.
I'll add something here that I learned fairly recently. I come from the San Francisco area, where building rents are very high. And it turns out that the energy piece of that is almost rounding error given the amount of rent. So if we switch to more of a services concept, that might actually help us with that problem.
Yeah, if you think about it as a pyramid and flip it on its head in a way, the energy savings that we're talking about are really just at the apex, right, at the very base. And let's say that's a factor of 1. As you start thinking about occupancy of the building and the rental, that actually increases by a factor of 10. And you start to think about employee productivity, it starts to increase even more. So if we flip this whole thing in its head and you just think as the light source as a point of information, you start to unlock a lot of power.
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. I mean, Rob, I'm curious, is what you're seeing as well in terms of rolling out the solutions like the partnership that you've got with Philips. Like what needs to happen? Is these kinds of financing schemes helpful as well, or what else do you need to see to move this forward?
Absolutely, and we've talked about lighting as a service and all these other components. What we see is, and Bill talked about the fact of the lights provide us tremendous amount of data. And typically when we see from a retrofit marketplace is people look at it from a system level perspective. And the value is in the data. And people say, well, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with all this data. But as the world evolves, it's becoming a software-centric world. And it's a very different mindset for operators and owners to look at it from that point of view where it's constantly evolving and changing. So it's important to look at it from a data set perspective, understand the value of that data that could be today, but also let's think 5, 10 years from now, and quite frankly, some of that software is not developed yet, but that's where the world is moving towards, and I think that will help from the standpoint of looking at that space.
Sure, that makes so much sense. Ed, what are your thoughts on some of this as well?
Well, on building operations, on renovations, about, I want to say 16 months ago, a little over a year before the last Climate Week in New York City, we were asked by a group in New York that was advising the mayor to see how far they can get the building sector toward zero emissions by 2050. So we undertook a study, and what we had found out was that during the Bloomberg years, most of the emissions reductions was fuel switching, essentially going from coal to gas, and he got a 17% reduction. But if you look through all those years from 2005 to 2013, the addition of buildings raised the emissions. The renovation of buildings reduced the emissions roughly by that amount. So they washed each other out, but there were no more savings. So all the savings were in fuel switching. But now the fuel switching's done, so basically the buck stops here, and how do you get things under control? So we dug into the numbers really deeply, and we were scratching our heads and trying to figure out how we're going to get more renovation and get the emissions down in the building sector, because it was 71% of all New York City emissions. So if we didn't address that, there was no way you can get to 80 by 50 or 0 by 50. We did find one statistic that really stood out, and that was that there was about 28,000 buildings that changed hands a year in New York City that were bought and sold. And these are at prices of $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 a square foot. So to upgrade them is a very teeny percentage of that, is 1%, 2%, 3%, something like that. And if you put it on the purchaser rather than on the seller, now you've overcome the financing issue, because the purchaser, if you're buying at $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 a square foot, you obviously have money, and you have the financing is in place to add a little bit more to get the energy reductions. So you overcome this whole financing issue. So we looked at those numbers, put a plan together, gave it to the city, and they did announce 80 by 50, but now there's a technical working group and a whole bunch of groups that are trying to work through all these numbers and all these issues. We've since looked at cities in California, at San Francisco, at Palo Alto. We were invited to Boston, to the Green Ribbon Commission. So we had to look at Boston. We found exactly the same thing. In Boston, they did fuel switching to get to about a 15% reduction in terms of their emissions, and then they were stuck. Right. New buildings were adding, renovations were reducing, pretty much leveled out, and we found that they also at purchase have a huge number of buildings that turn over. So if they address the issue at that point, they can then have a huge impact.
Right. Mm-hmm. Makes so much sense. And I mean, it's interesting because just listening to some of the discussion, particularly around the data, it makes us think about what we can be doing at World GBC as we go forward to really move. Oh, did you want to come in, Ed?
Yeah, there's just one other point I wanted to make. When we talk to the real estate industry, there's obviously an issue when people are occupying a building. You can't do deep efficiency renovations. So you have to allow an out, in a sense, for the buyer. And the out was to purchase renewables, or to do a minimum, do all the renovation, like lighting systems are easy to do, thermostats, and there are a whole bunch of things you can do that don't disrupt building operations if people are occupying the building and they're not doing a renovation. But purchasing renewables, especially local renewables, creates a whole new market for those renewables. And so that became the out that got the industry to support.
Does that resonate?
It does very well. It's a great idea. It's something I think we should explore here in the U.S. and also overseas.
Yeah. I mean, something that you guys brought up around data. I mean, both Ken, you mentioned that, and Bill as well. It's something that, as we're working forward with our net zero certification, that there's a lot more that we need to do to show the data, to show how these buildings can be operating, to help then guide further action. And so I think that's one thing kind of going away from the panel today that we'll really take on board at World GBC. A lot of our green building councils around the world manage certifications like LEED. Some of them work on BREEAM. They have their own certifications like Green Star. We're developing the net zero certification. How can we help play some of that role? I think in sharing data, it's just not something that had really come to mind before, but I can see how important that is for policymakers, for companies. I mean, another thing that we're really interested in is the link with health and well-being, and the 5 to 10 years sticks in my head around the ability for companies or governments to be able to make capital investments and have to wait 10 years to pay that back. I can see that as quite challenging. And we're doing a project in our own office in the UK with Philips, and what we're going to do is a pre and post occupancy study with our own staff and the UK Green Building Council staff to really show how did their productivity change in the office, how did their well-being change in the office, because for many companies 90% of operating costs come from people, right? So I think if we can help make that case through this own project that we're doing with Philips, I think that can help. So I'd love to hear from each of you, some ideas that may have been triggered from this panel, this discussion that you can be going away and doing to help us move forward from the renovation challenge, the financing challenge, some of the barriers that we've outlined today.
So, Terry, I guess I'll go first. So, building on this, I think one of the things that we'll do is continue to focus on light as a service and providing data from the lights themselves. But we also have to walk the talk. So, a couple things we've announced and will accelerate is one, by 2020, we're going to become 100% carbon neutral. And two, also we'll use 100% renewable energy. And then working as a member of as a supporter of the Clean Energy Ministerial, we've committed to sell 2 billion LED light points in just 4 years from now. So from now until 2020, we'll get that done because of the savings that it can commit and achieve. The other thing is just work with our alliance partners like Cisco and then also SAP and the Cityscape and others to provide the data that's necessary for software to make buildings and cityscapes smarter. Because as we move forward, we need to achieve some things, right? And I'll just focus on my industry, but we should all take this challenge for our own industries, which is our challenge to our industry is by 2020, all new buildings should have LED. It's just a matter of fact that it pays off. By 2025, all street lights should be LED as well, because a large portion of our energy consumption is in our cities. And if we do that, we can also connect them better to IoT through the energy savings. And then finally, by 2030, if we go forward, we like to challenge everybody to make all buildings, whether they're new or retrofit, LED smart buildings. And that's where I'd like to leave it.
Great. It's a great call to action. I mean, 2020 is around the corner, but there's really no reason today that we can't move ahead on those lighting technologies and give it a bit longer, to really do the deep retrofits in the buildings, the net zero. But I mean, I think that the trajectory is just clear. Like, there's no time to waste. Let's just move towards this. I mean, Ken, from your perspective, what next?
Well, I continue with my data obsession.
Yeah.
I think we have a huge need to improve access to data and to standardize it. We're starting to see that. We're starting to see results. And the thing that I think it will also kick off are a whole bunch of entrepreneurs using that data in some interesting ways that we're not thinking about yet. I'll pick up on a couple of Bill's. In the public sector with LEDs, Caltrans is the biggest of a lot of things in California, the California Transportation Agency. They're the largest arborist in the state. They also have the most lights. And so they're busily replacing them. Many, many cities in California are doing that. It's cost effective. How do we get that to the building sector? We need to think about that more, and I think that's part of what our program is going to be in terms of some of the incentives. In addition, California has about $300 million annually for R&D across the electricity sector, and there may be ways to expand that as well. I really like the idea of the commercial building turnover that Ed mentioned, and I'm going to take that back and see what we can do about it. And then because, Terry, you mentioned health impacts, I should mention that I have kind of a unique person on my staff who's got a dual degree. She's a medical doctor and a public policy degree. And she has really reframed our thinking about a lot of these issues, including the health benefits of energy efficiency. So it's something that we're actually trying to integrate into a lot of what we're doing, including we're rewriting our general plan guidelines, and that has become a part of what our theme is.
Okay, great. Just something that you mentioned there, which I'd love to hear a bit more from you. You mentioned the link with, how entrepreneurs can be using some of that data. Can you tell us more about that? Because you hear like cities doing these hackathons. And I'm always curious about what does that mean kind of concretely, and what does that lead to?
I've heard all kinds of things. I wish I could, sort of pull them up and tell you. So just as a couple of examples, in Los Angeles, because of the LADWP data that I mentioned, There are already entities that are saying, well, here's a hotspot and here's a hotspot. We can go in and offer the utility the ability to hire us to take action and invest in a different way. That's an entity that would be some form of a middle man to figure out why is it that this is a particular hotspot of energy usage. The benchmarking data is giving building owners a whole new way to relate to services that come in and talk about how to provide reductions to, they're seeing the writing on the wall with the benchmarking that they're going to actually have to have specific reductions over time. And that's creating, for example, you can hearkening back to some of the discussion of the panels this morning, you might want to add a storage system to your building that not only allows you to use your solar system more effectively, but you can also sell energy from your building reduction of usage back into the grid. So there's all kinds of things like that that are possible.
So it's amazing what happens when you set that data free. That it
Correct.
Just, yeah, some really interesting uses. Okay, great. So Rob, what about you? I mean, just kind of listening to some of this dialogue, what do you think you're going to go away at Cisco and do? What needs to happen next from your perspective?
Yeah, so we're going to be steadfast on connecting the unconnected without a doubt, right? The opportunity that we see, just the data you can get from lighting is just absolutely remarkable. Yeah. Things you didn't think about before, and some of the other systems that we see that are coming online, but also the network-derived data. That's predominantly the place that we play in the world is from a network perspective. The amount of data that we have there and the insights that we can provide for those incredibly smart kids coming out of college, as I alluded to before, in terms of building these applications that we never even thought of before. But we're going to continue to innovate in this space. We believe it's tremendous in terms of what's possible moving forward here from the standpoint of looking at the connected, the digital ceiling, as well as other components on the in-building space.
Yeah, again, data, innovation.
Data,
yeah,
innovation,
fantastic.
that's what we do.
Ed?
Yeah, there's just so much that's going on and that needs to happen. One thing just quickly is when you talk about 1.1 billion people in 15 years and building out a Western hemisphere, that's an awful lot of products and awful lot of materials. All that's going to take energy. We don't even have benchmarks yet for building construction and what the carbon emissions are of just putting up a building. We know that it's roughly 15 years of building operations just to pay off the debt of building a building. So we've gotten together and created a network with the Carbon Leadership Forum, MIT, and developing actually the baselines for different building types at different heights and different sizes, the baseline carbon emissions of actually building a building to that scale, and then are going to set targets below that so architects can design to those targets, because essentially they are the gatekeepers of building buildings, and they specify every material that goes into a building. So, and they're a willing partner, so we know that. So that's one thing going forward. Another thing is China. I mean, you can't talk about getting this situation under control unless you talk about China, because a huge amount of building is going to happen. I think 38 to 35 to 40% of all building construction in the next 15 years are going to happen just in China. So I think about a year and a half ago we went to China, and not much happening. We issued a China Accord where we asked all the international firms working in China and all the Chinese firms that were planning and designing buildings there to sign an accord, essentially pledging that they would design to carbon neutral or near carbon neutral standards. Took a long time to get the international firms on board. We got them on board. We went to China, and within 2 months they got the whole country, every LDI in the country to sign on. That doesn't mean they're doing it, but now we'll hold this big workshop and forum on actually how to get this done next week, so in 3 weeks. So when China moves, they move very, very quickly, and obviously since Paris and since they have a vested interest in the Paris Agreement and getting it all ratified, they really are beginning to move, and they're moving, we think, very, very quickly. We'll know a lot more in about a month and a half.
It's a huge opportunity. I read somewhere that China builds the equivalent of the city of Rome every 3 weeks, which is just staggering. And we're also excited. Our China Green Building Council, I believe, is here today and also attending the Net Zero workshop to really, if we can get a Net Zero certification in China, it'll really take off. So, I think there's been some really interesting themes and conclusions coming out of today's discussion. For me, the big takeaway is around data. Remember, because we're in New York, Tony Malkin, who was responsible for the Empire State Building retrofit with a number of partners, always talked about the Prius effect with data and some of the technologies and the smart meters that they installed in the Empire State Building, that you kind of become obsessed with how well you can make your building perform when you can actually see the numbers. And people say that when you drive a Prius, that it's the same kind of effect. You're like constantly obsessed. How much fuel can I save? And I think that also goes into a bit in transparency, that with the Paris Agreement, the countries have to stand up, every 5 years and have basically a climate weigh-in. So to say, how are they doing against their INDCs? And I think what we'll start seeing is that happening in the corporate sector as well. Many commitments were made, including Philips' carbon neutral commitment. We made a number of commitments, and I think we'll all start holding ourselves to account in the same way that countries will as a part of the Paris Agreement, standing up every 5 years for our weigh-in. What's our data looking like? How are we making progress? So I think that's an important theme. The new financing solutions, I think it's really encouraging. I think the OPEX model is really encouraging. You don't then need to wait for the 10 years. There's some other financing models that are coming through. Today we're announcing a project in Europe around green mortgages. So how do we work with the banks in Europe on facilitating green mortgages, which can help drive greater retrofits as well? Green bonds, I know there's a lot of discussion around that. So I think those new financing solutions are going to be key. I think clever policies as well, benchmarking, so you're getting the data, but also really driving the market in a way that you can then create momentum. I think California is just fantastic to see those targets set, and we're hoping that more states and regions through the climate groups network, but also cities will start doing more of that. And innovation, I think we just have to keep innovating, and it's great to see what Cisco and Philips are doing. The cost of LEDs keeps coming down. The technology keeps improving, and that just needs to keep happening if we're going to meet these targets. But just finally, I think also is being people-centric with a lot of these technologies and not forgetting people in the equation, that 90% of our time is spent in buildings, and any energy efficiency improvements we make to a building has an effect on people. And if we don't do them right, then we're never going to meet these targets, because people aren't going to be wanting to be in these buildings that have the deep efficiencies unless we make them human-centric. So I think those are some really key conclusions from today. So thank you to all the panelists. It was a great discussion. Thank you, Eric, for your opening, and the rulers really helped bring home the message of where we need to get to stop sea level rise. We are going to move downstairs in a few minutes for a reception. Philips is going to be launching the Brighter Lives, Better World Sustainability Program, so invite you all to go downstairs. But first, we're going to see a short film, and when the film is over, please join us downstairs for a reception, which is where we had lunch earlier. So thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you to the audience.
Our world is changing. Rising temperatures caused by carbon emissions threaten our planet. The population is growing. 10 billion people will inhabit the Earth by 2050. 2/3 of them living in cities. More people need more resources, more water, more food, more light. Brighter lives, better world is our commitment. Connected LED lighting reduces energy consumption by up to 80%. The right light, at the right time, at the right place, makes our lives better. And worldwide, LED could reduce lighting share of electricity consumption from 15% to 8%. It helps us to live more fully, more safely, to see better, feel better, and function better. We are leading the transition to a circular economy. with lighting that can be reused and remanufactured. And we are committed to sustainable operations. By 2020, our operations will be carbon neutral and powered by 100% renewable electricity. We'll eliminate non-hazardous waste to landfill at our manufacturing sites, strive for a zero-injury, zero-illness workplace, and help our suppliers to manage substances and reduce their carbon footprint. At Philips Lighting, we don't just talk about sustainability, we're walking the talk. Innovation and you. Philips.